Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today for this very important conversation about the crisis at the U.S.-Mexico border. I'm your host, Samantha Aguilar, and today our topic will focus specifically on the psychological effects of making the journey across the U.S.-Mexico border. The crisis at the border can be traced back to the 1920s when the U.S. established its first migration restriction and began patrolling the southern border. While this topic has since continued to be covered, I've felt that many times during my reporting. I found that the focus heavily revolved around dangers at the border, human trafficking, gang violence, drug cartels, and even border militarization. And while these topics should continue to be covered and are a huge part of the narrative that migrants live, one topic that I felt hasn't had as much attention is the psychological effects that come with making the journey across the border and into U.S. soil. So I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. Stephanie Torres, a clinical psychologist specializing in children and family trauma. She currently works at the University of Illinois in the Department of Educational Psychology. Dr. Torres, thank you so much for joining us today. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about your work in this field?
Thank you. I'm Dr. Stephanie Torres. I work a lot with children, adolescents, and families who have gone through really traumatic or stressful events, specifically Latinx families who have been impacted by migration or immigration trauma, things such as family separation, detention and deportation, discrimination, just really the day-to-day trauma of living as an immigrant in our society today. And my research is really similar. At UIC in my department right now, I'm really focused on thinking of how immigration policies, immigration practices, and climate impact mental health and well-being among Latinx families. These are things that happen on the systemic level, right? So thinking about Title 42, for example, that's been in the news recently with the Biden administration, right? We think about zero tolerance policies or the end of public charge under our previous administration. And then we just think about procedures like detention, deportation, increased surveillance at the borders, policing. And then climate, which is a huge thing. For example, just the rise in anti-immigrant sentiments, discrimination, racism among our immigrant and refugee communities. And so I'm really interested in how those impact mental health and well-being among both parents and their children, which of course we know does, which I'm naming structural racism. So the unfair, inequitable treatment that immigrant Latino families face as a result of policies, procedures, etc. So difficulty communicating in English, discrimination, racism, employment issues, fear of deportation, economic difficulties, right? This is all linked to kind of the structural pieces in our society. So myself and our community partner are kind of putting our heads together and thinking of ways we can help families cope with the stress of this happening at the systemic level, while also figuring out ways to navigate the community, become empowered, become leaders in immigration movements, which are just as important.
Thank you for breaking that up for us. Before we really jump in too deep, I just want to ask, what is trauma and how can that impact an individual's mental health?
So trauma is one of those words I think that's often thrown out there, right? And so when I think about trauma, I like to define trauma using the 3 E's: events, experiences, and effects. So events is what happens, right? What is the trauma? So it could be an acute trauma, which is what we think of like as a trauma that has a beginning and an end. So a car accident, right? A beginning and a clear end. But then there's other complex traumas. For example, deportation, detention can be long going. Family violence can be chronic, right? There's no clear beginning, middle, or end. And we find that trauma that's complex really impacts mental health and well-being a lot more. There's no time to heal. There's no time to grieve. It's just ongoing. So that's the first E. So trauma is an event, something that happens, right? The second is the experience. So how do you experience trauma? And that is what turns trauma into traumatic. So how do we experience the actual trauma? Did we have time to grieve? Did we have time to prepare? So for example, if we're thinking about death, was it unexpected? Was it expected? Who was that person? Did we have mixed feelings about that person? All of these experiences are really unique and really come from our own lens of how we see the world. So, is the world safe anymore? Can I trust people anymore?
Right.
And then the third E is the effects. So the long lasting impacts of trauma. And this is when we get into PTSD, right? Or post-traumatic stress disorder. So these are things such as nightmares, hypervigilance, like always looking over your shoulder to make sure no one's there, mood issues like depression and anger, flashbacks, things coming to your mind when you don't want them to, right? All of those things are long-lasting effects and can really impact individuals in different ways: work, school, relationships, just the way you see the world.
Absolutely. To get more specific, how does trauma and its effects show in someone who has just migrated to the US and made the journey from their home country across sometimes even multiple borders to get to the US?
So when we think of the 3 E's, we can apply that to our immigrant communities, specifically within Latinx immigrants. And so let's say we're talking about Mexican families, and we have a Mexican individual who is from Morelia, right, or Michoacan. And in their home state, they're facing a lot of violence, a lot of cartel violence, a lot of threats to their family members. And they decide, we need to migrate, right? We need to get out of here and travel to the US where it's safer. That person is already carrying on their journey the trauma that they face in their home country,
Right.
This persecution, this constant fear of living in a place where you're not safe, on top of maybe the other things like maybe lack of education or healthcare is something they've also experienced. And so that family then has experiences en route or reaching the US border. And we know that's very different for a lot of families. Some people, use coyotes to get over the border. Some people take trains. Some people walk. Some people take a plane, right? Depending on that experience, that could also be additional trauma: kidnappings, assaults, sickness, being separated from family members when you're on your journey. So again, those families then carry the impact of trauma and stress in migration. And then you get to the US, which I think a lot of people coming here is like, the US is going to be great. It's going to change. Very hopeful, right? And when one gets here, we realize that not so much. There is a ton of trauma that happens just by stepping foot over the border, from things as immediate as family and child separation, detention, deportation, abuse by Border Patrol, but then just living in the US with the different customs and norms, but also just with having a new language, discrimination. Immigrant families sometimes settle in lower income areas because of finances, community violence. All these things then pile up on top of the trauma from en route, on top of the trauma from your home. And this creates this like invisible backpack of sorts that each person carries and they walk around with, of just all these things, this burden, right? And so when we work with immigrant families, or when we talk with immigrant families, we really need to realize that these families have a lot. They have a lot of things they're carrying. And so part of the work I try to do is, okay, what are some things we can reshuffle in that backpack to make it easier to carry? And what are some things we can take away? And so that's kind of my passion for doing things on individual levels and also systemic levels. So it's a very complex, thing. And I think that thinking about trauma in different systems, really beyond the individual, we need to take into account the context that that person is in.
Right. And I think one of the biggest lessons for me was learning about the different stages of trauma that one can experience on this journey. So like you said, there quite literally are 3 different and prevalent stages where trauma can present itself during their journey to the US. So for individuals who maybe don't process this trauma or don't get the psychological help that they need, what can happen?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. And so before I answer that too, I definitely want to stress too that, our community is resilient, right? Like, we've been through a lot, and we can, keep going on and, perhaps never be affected in the ways that, other folks might think, right? We're resilient and we're strong. And I think that's always important to remember when thinking about trauma, right? It's this combination of, how can we help? But mostly, how can we help with the things that this person already has? And so long-term trauma, in general, has a lot of effects. It can affect really across the board in development with children as well as adults. So with children, you think about impacts on learning, impacts on relationships, friendships. Sometimes when, trauma turns into that third E, right, PTSD, you see kids who are in school and can't pay attention. They fall behind in schoolwork. Maybe they're kids that are really quiet, or maybe they're kids that might be more aggressive and talk back, and they're labeled bad, because of their behavior, right? When they're really having some tough times at home or have some tough things that are in their invisible backpack. We also see that adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, which are some of the chronic stress I was talking about, have been linked to higher mortality rates, diabetes, increased risk of suicide. So it doesn't only impact the mental health well-being aspect, but it really impacts health, public health, the economy, a wide range of things, which is why I always push for the fact that everyone needs to care about trauma within immigrant refugee communities, because it really impacts all of us, aside from being a social justice issue.
Trauma like the one migrants face can be extremely heavy, and obviously this journey is very specific to these individuals. So how is treatment for migrants different than the treatment that you might give a different individual?
Great question. As a psychologist, we have what we call evidence-based treatments for trauma that are based in science and we know work. The caveat I always give is obviously one size doesn't fit all. And when you have migrants, it is just so much more complex because of all the different context that person is in and all the different stressors. So for example, an individual who might come to my office who's, let's say, a 16-year-old girl who is in a detention center for 10 months and has trauma of that detention center. There's ways we can process what happened there. The reality is that person may be still undocumented. That person may still be in foster care. That person may not speak English still and may be struggling in school. Sometimes there's so many other things that come along with trauma that as a psychologist, you also need to be an advocate and a case manager and a secretary and all those things, right? So you find yourself not only doing traditional evidence-based therapy, but you find yourself thinking of, okay, how do I connect this kid with lawyers? How do I call the school and say, hey, she needs to be put in ELL? And so it's really going above and beyond and becoming an advocate. For immigrants and refugees, there's this uncertainty of being in this country. There's loss and automatic grief that really complicates it. And also sometimes there are things that you just can't change, right? So you can't change legal status as a psychologist. And so it's also, a balance too on figuring out ways to advocate that are within our control.
Do you think that there's enough research on this topic and that there are enough psychologists who understand the severity of this issue and know how to properly offer services?
Yeah, I don't think there's ever going to be enough of us. I think, though, in the past few years, I've seen more and more people gain interest in this topic, which I'm really excited about. And other folks like in journalism, like yourself, who have also gained interest in this topics. And something I always say is, addressing trauma, being trauma informed within immigrant communities is not just the job of mental health professionals. It's really all of our jobs, right? From journalism to medicine to public health to sociology to English, like all of us really need to be working together to figure out ways to really help increase access to services, change policies that impact mental health. And there's never enough of us. One of the things that I always talk about is from a psychology perspective, there's not a ton of me. There's not a ton of Latinas who are bilingual and who work in community spaces. That's a huge barrier in terms of access to mental health. And that's something that I've definitely seen. I've often been the only Latina bilingual provider at many places in Chicago, which is saying a lot. Let's think about rural areas where there's new folks coming in, like North Carolina, the South. And so just really a call for increased access to training for folks who want to be in this field.
Absolutely. And beyond the lack of resources, are there other specific reasons why migrants may be hesitant to reach out and look for this type of help?
There is a lot of structural and a lot of cultural issues. So by structural, I mean, insurance is a huge one. We think about, undocumented folks not having access to insurance. And in the state of Illinois, finally, seniors in Illinois can now access healthcare with insurance. And then also just things such as work. Having jobs that may be lower wage or may be more stringent and not being able to tell your employer, hey, I'm going to take off. And aside from that, there's transportation issues, there's childcare, there's a lot of these barriers. And then on the cultural side, it's just the issue of stigma of mental health.
Yes.
I think there's been a lot of efforts in the Latino community to improve access to mental health care through community health workers or promotoras, which are individuals that are part of the community that kind of integrate mental health in church, in community organizations, and things that are more natural feeling, instead of a person coming into an office in a big building that says psychiatry. There's the stigma of just talking about your own problems outside of your own family. I know from the families I've worked with, and as a Latina myself, it's just almost this mark of shame of like, I didn't raise my kid right. Why do they have problems? Am I not a good mom? What is my comadre going to think if I go out and I get services for my kid? What if he's just bad behaved or malcriado? And so there's all this language that exists and this stigma. And that's why, on top of all the other things I've talked about, folks sometimes don't access care. And sometimes when they get there, the providers or other things, might not do the best job at retaining people, and they end up leaving. So there's a lot of work to be done in addressing both of those barriers.
Yes, and I do remember that we talked about migration status and that being a huge fear for a lot of people, and one of the reasons they don't usually want to reach out and really put themselves out there. And we talked about how important it is for psychologists to really understand the current policies, because if they don't, then maybe they won't be able to protect these people who are reaching out for help.
Absolutely. When you access services, they ask you a lot of personal questions. And folks who are undocumented, understandably, are really scared to access those, because what happens if I say something? They know who I am, they can deport me, they can deport my husband. That's why you sometimes see family members who are citizens still be afraid of accessing services, because perhaps they'd have a family member who doesn't have status. And I think that's really where psychologists and other folks can come in and really be informed what the policies are, what their rights are. So really empowering families to know, hey, I have rights, because those families can empower their kids, empower other families, become involved in grassroots movements. And then that's really how we enact change on those structural levels. But at a bare minimum, everyone should really know policies. And even with that, just create a welcoming environment, right? Have things, bilingual, have signs, immigrants and refugees are welcomed here. So those are really small, actionable things you can do to really create a more comfortable spot.
You were talking about empowering communities, and not just parents, but children too. What happens if trauma maybe isn't treated at the first generation level? Is it possible to be passed down to generations?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I'm really glad you brought that up. When I think about trauma, and I think a lot of people don't think about this, we also have intergenerational and historical trauma, right? These legacies of trauma that, we've often thought about with our native communities. We think about forced, migration and genocide. And that really applies across the board to our minoritized communities, including Latino communities. And intergenerational trauma is basic, where a parent undergoes trauma and then in some way, genetically, it's proven, environmentally, passes it on to their child, and that child is more at risk for developing post-traumatic stress disorder, and so on and so on. That combined with historical trauma, so like legacies of slavery and genocide and war, are actually proven to be passed down throughout generations. And then we think about equity and we think about inequalities within our Brown, Black, Indigenous communities, and we can trace a lot of that to historical legacies of colonialism and trauma and genocide. The historical context is really important. With immigration, one of the things I've been thinking about and I've read is that the legacies of family separation that are happening now and during the previous administration, that is probably going to be a historical legacy of trauma, an intergenerational trauma. Those kids and families who have undergone that without help, without breaking that cycle, may pass it on to their kids and future generations. And so, it's not just what's happening now that's horrifying, it's the fact that it's really damaging the Latino community in the long term. And I find a lot of people don't really think about intergenerational trauma. So knowledge of this trauma, knowledge that it could be broken and you can be empowered and you can have rights, is also really healing.
I agree. I think generational trauma isn't always something you realize is happening, because it's the way that your family copes with trauma. It's the way that you were brought up, and sometimes you just can't make those connections. I was actually talking to a psychologist here in Los Angeles, Julissa Morales. She's great, and we discussed hoarding as a way of coping. So sometimes, she was saying, many of these migrants who come from poverty, when they move to the US, will take on some of these coping mechanisms like hoarding, because before they never had access to all these things, and so they feel like they really have to latch on to them. So I think this topic is just so fascinating because people really have no idea that it's happening and that it can be passed on.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's why, as a psychologist, I always love family therapy and group therapy because like this issue is so beyond the individual.
For sure. And obviously this is a very complex topic that continues to develop, especially right now at the border. At the US-Mexico border, we have Ukrainians coming in and seeking asylum. It's something that is always developing, especially with the militarization of the border and migrants searching for new ways and different routes to get into the US. And, that also adds to trauma and affects the journey. So what steps do you think we can take to really help with this crisis? Is there more research in the field that needs to be done? Is it more resources at the border?
I think about it in different ways. I mean, on a systemic level, my personal opinion is just a rehaul of our immigration system as it is. To be honest, I think that is a goal that is lofty. But honestly, I think when we think about equity and policies and the legacies of why we have these immigration policies and why they were enacted and how they are often enacted because of racist ideology with not just Latinos, with Asian immigrants, with Native populations in their own homeland. And so critical look at our immigration system and the history and a complete rehaul, honestly, is what's really going to help. I think also there are things that we can do in terms of electing, local officials, empowering Latinos who can vote to vote, especially in states where democracy is quite in danger and there's a lot of voter suppression. The biggest thing with researchers is oftentimes, researchers have this idea, we go in, we say, great, this is going to help you, and then we leave. But it really needs to come from the community. I mean, who am a daughter of immigrants, I'm Latina, bilingual, I still am not truly part of the community that I work with. I want the change to come from those people in the community. It needs to involve the people that it affects, right? Which is the Latino community and all communities who are oppressed and minoritized.
100%. I just want to thank you again for sitting with us and having the conversation. It was extremely informative for me and for those of us who might not fully understand how traumatic and how deeply rooted this crisis is in our society, and to really maybe hopefully understand a little bit better the experiences of migrants. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And I really appreciate the space to talk about this. And I, again, just want to reemphasize that even though I'm a psychologist, I'm a mental health professional, this issue is really for all of us, and that everyone in our own respective disciplines can really help contribute to equity within the Latinx community.